Anyone interested in raising money for your deals? All right, awesome. And we're going to start with your financial story, and I want you to sort of understand the context of that, because your ability to be able to own, understand, and communicate your financial story is going to directly impact your ability to raise money, okay? Now, with that being said, I don't want you leaving here saying, if I don't understand my financial story, I can't raise money, because that's not the case, right? Before I even knew what my financial story was or any of this, I was able to go out there and raise money. Any idea why I was able to go out and raise money before I even had any idea what a financial story was? Yep.
Your deals were good.
Your deals were good. Exactly, right? And what have you guys been spending time this weekend learning, right? How to find good deals, where to find good deals. You know, I was in here most of the weekend, but I was popping in and out, and every time I came in, I either saw a video of someone in the inner circle doing deals on the money they made, or even people in the audience talking about money they made, right, doing deals. But you're absolutely right. It's about finding the good deals. So that's why the financial story is just another aspect of that. You have a great deal and a powerful way to communicate your financial story. It's an unbeatable combination. So we'll just do a quick recap of what I went over yesterday. I spoke about the 5 freedom traits, right, that you have to have in your business. Number 1 is control, not only in your business, but your life, right? Control over your income, how you're making that money. Control over your investments. Control over your retirement accounts, right, which Rick, I know, was talking to you guys about, and the ability to do that. The second thing was making sure that you're trendy, right, investing in and pursuing ideas or investments that are following a trend, that have favorable demographics. Can anyone remember a couple of the trends in real estate that had favorable trends and demographics that I mentioned yesterday? Yeah?
Got a lot of foreclosures. Rents went up, so you invested more in property.
Okay. Absolutely, great. He was saying there were a lot of foreclosures, rents went up, so we invested in more apartments. Yep, absolutely. So there were apartments. We spoke about low-income housing, student housing, because of the demographics. The third thing was your ability to be flexible, right? And in particularly from a financial standpoint, doing what you need to do to set yourself up financially so that you're nimble to be able to take advantage of the opportunities when they present themselves. Number 4 was being printable, right? Literally creating your own printing press, which we've been talking about this weekend, right? You guys have been learning how to wholesale. That's one way to do that. And other businesses. I know Eric was up here yesterday, right, talking about flipping landlords, right? Another business, another way to become printable and generate money. And the 5th thing was urgent, right? A combination of knowing when to be urgent with those income-producing activities, those things that are going to put money in your pocket now as soon as possible, and the things to be patient on that you don't have to work on immediately. We spoke about how to generate infinite returns, right? And I shared the infinite wealth formula, the triangle there, where starting with having a minimum of 25% equity, right? The properties have to cash flow. And as long as you have those 2 things, you then would be able to cash out and achieve an infinite return on your investment. So today, as I said, we're going to talk about owning your financial story. And let's start with, what is your financial story, right? You've heard me talk about that a few times. What is that? Your financial story simply is the interpretation of your personal financial documents. It's the interpretation of your personal financial documents, right? And we're going to get into what those financial documents are in a moment. But, you know, why is this important? It's important because it allows you to understand the what-so around your finances, okay? As I shared yesterday for myself, I thought I knew what was going on with my finances, making all this money, and it wasn't until my wife kind of hit me with that zinger that had me take a step back and really look and actually start to find out exactly what was going on. So for some of you, you may already know exactly what's going on with your finances. For some of you, it could be a wake-up call to maybe look at some things that you didn't want to look at, like I didn't really want to look at until I was forced to. And then, whatever it is that you look at, it allows you to control the story that's being told. Because whether or not you're telling the story, a story is being told, so you might as well be the one telling your own story, right? And it makes it easier to create wealth, it makes it easier to raise money, and it allows you to know the outcome before you ask for money. When I asked who wants to learn how to raise money for their deals, every hand in the place went up. Well, how about if you could know the outcome as you went out there to raise money, if you could know whether or not you're going to raise that money before you even ask someone for money? Would you like that? Right. The reason why is most of us, when we go for a loan or we go to raise money, we're just like, man, I want to go raise money. You go to the bank, you fill out an application, hey, will you give me some money? Or you approach someone saying, hey, I want some money. Right? But if you knew what their underwriting criteria was, if you knew how they were going to judge you, if you knew how they were going to evaluate you, you could prepare all that ahead of time. If you actually did the work that they do from an underwriting perspective, you would know before you even went to the bank or to an investor or whomever the case may be, whether or not you were going to be accepted. Does that make sense? Okay. So the financial story solution is a three-step process, all right? The first step is where we're going to deal with what's going on in the present, and it's where you identify your scorecard, all right? Step two, we're going to take a journey back down memory lane, and we're going to look into your past. And this is where you're going to understand the story of your past. Step three is where you get to create a new story, where you start talking about the future. And oftentimes, typically with investors, is they're great at talking about the future, right? And I'm sure you've spoken a lot about that this weekend. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to wholesale X amount of deals, or I'm going to buy X amount of investments, or whatever the case may be, right? You paint this beautiful picture. But then when you look at your past, or maybe even if you look at where you're at currently, there's sort of an incongruency there. There's not quite an alignment between those three steps. And the real power of this is when you can bring alignment between those three steps. So we're going to start with step one, which is identifying your scorecard and the personal financial documents that we're going to look at for that. So one, we're going to look at your personal financial statement. Two, your schedule of real estate owned, your global pro forma, and a credit report. And we're going to go through all these. I'm just kind of giving you the overview, and then we're going to dive in one by one, okay? Second, understanding your story, the past. You look at your last 2 to 3 years tax returns. And then three, as we said, we're going to create a new story and craft that future. So your personal financial statement looks something like this, right? This is actually a personal financial statement. And it consists of, up top, it has your personal information, and then underneath that, it has kind of the balance sheet, right? As you see there on the right, simply your assets and your liabilities, and underneath that, the income statement with your income and expenses. So the personal financial statement on a single sheet of paper is a snapshot in time. So if you were to fill out a personal financial statement today, that will show you how you're doing today, right now, both from a net worth standpoint, your assets minus your liabilities, and it also allows you to see how you're doing from an income and expense standpoint, money you're making minus money you have going out, okay? And you put that together, and you get a personal financial statement. Anytime you go to get a bank loan, if you haven't yet, personal financial statement is one of the first things that they ask for, because this allows the banker to see how you're doing financially. The second thing that they're going to ask for is a schedule of real estate owned if you own real estate. So it's fine if you're looking to own real estate, you don't own any yet, this is going to be blank. But for those of you that do own real estate, you're going to fill out everything on the schedule of real estate owned, where it's going to break down property by property, what you own. It's going to ask for what the mortgage payment is, who's the lender, how much debt do you have on the property, and what it's worth. The next document is the global pro forma. So all the documents that you listed on your schedule of real estate owned, they're going to show up on the global pro forma. What a global pro forma is, it is global, right? So it shows all of the real estate you own, and it shows how it's performing from an income and expense standpoint. So if you look at the spreadsheet there, up top you have total gross rents, you have expenses, and then it goes down to net operating income and the net funds per property there. And then there's a total number, right? So I'm going to show for every single property, income minus expenses, and then there's going to be a total number at the end, so they can see individually how each property is performing, as well as how my portfolio or your portfolio is doing from a global perspective. Does that make sense? Okay. There's one number down there at the bottom. I don't know if you guys can see in the back, so I'll mention it, but it says DSCR. Does anyone know what that is? DSCR, what that stands for? Well, someone started on the right track. It stands for debt service coverage ratio. So write that down because that's extremely important. Debt service coverage ratio. And the banks, this is one of the key things that the banks look at when they're underwriting you as a borrower as well as underwriting your deal. And what the debt service coverage ratio does is it simply takes the net operating income, right? So in other words, the money that that property makes before you add any debt payments to it, and it divides it by what the debt service is going to be. Right? So it takes the money that you're actually making before a mortgage, and then it takes that mortgage payment in the denominator, and banks want to see a minimum debt service coverage ratio of 1.25. And so the higher the number that is, the better. Right? And this allows them to sort of judge and evaluate your ability to service the payments on that debt. So the higher the debt service coverage ratio is, the better. And minimally, banks like to see 1.25 or 1.20. Okay, so this is something that you can easily do. As you're looking at properties and you're evaluating properties, right, you're probably already doing a cash flow analysis, especially if you want to hold on to it in your rental portfolio. Well, now just add an extra calculation in there, figure out if you bought that property, what your monthly payment would be, and divide that by the money that's coming in, and you'd be able to determine the debt service coverage ratio. The next thing and last thing for step one is your credit report, right? I know actually, I think you guys have already been looking at your credit scores this weekend, which are extremely important, especially if you're looking to go to banks for financing. So if you haven't, did everyone end up pulling their credit report and getting their score this weekend? Yeah? Okay, that's fantastic. That's awesome because that's an important tool in your arsenal in being a real estate investor, knowing what that score is from a couple of perspectives. If your score is great and there's nothing to do, fantastic, right? You know you're bankable. If not, if there are some blemishes on your score, there are some things that you can do to improve that, right? There's credit repair companies. There's things that you can do to put yourself in a position to improve that credit score. So step one, right, where we're just identifying where we're at today, the 4 documents are, again, the personal financial statement, the schedule of real estate owned, the global pro forma, and the credit report. Those 4 documents will give you a snapshot of where you are today. The second thing is looking at your past, and that's where you're going to go and look at your last 2 to 3 year tax returns. Okay, now banks are going to require your last 2 to 3 year tax returns for you personally. And if you have any businesses that have tax returns, they're going to require those tax returns too. So they're going to look at, again, you personally as well as your business. And they're going to look for specific things in there, okay? Some of the things that they're looking for is consistency with income, and specifically, they like to see income growth as well. Right now, you can't necessarily, well, you can't control the past because it already happened, right? But it's helpful to be aware of what banks are looking for when they're looking at your income consistency, and they like to see steady growth. The other thing that they're going to look for is, do your tax returns, do they line up with the information that you filled out in step one? Remember that personal financial statement where you can write whatever you want on there? Well, if you said you made $100,000 and then they get your tax return and it shows $50,000, there needs to be some explaining there. And there actually may be legitimate reasons why, right? But that's one of the things that they want to make sure is that there's an alignment with all these documents that you're giving them. So that's something that you can easily do, making sure that what's on your tax returns is in alignment with the other documentation you gave them from step one. For example, some of the reasons why as real estate investors, you may say I make $100,000, but your tax returns show you only make $50,000 is because of a word depreciation. Does everyone know what depreciation is? Does anyone not know what depreciation is? Okay. Yeah, okay, no, thank you, I appreciate that. Thank you for having the courage to raise your hand and say that. So depreciation is a phantom expense. So when you own real estate, they allow you to have a write-off each year called depreciation. So you have a line item expense on your tax return, but you actually don't have to pay that amount out. So for example, if you had a $5,000 line item for depreciation, your profit or taxable income would be $5,000 less, because you have that line item for depreciation, but you actually didn't have to take the cash and pay that, right? So that's why your tax return could show a lower money that you made, but in reality, you've got to add back that depreciation to find the true cash that entered your pocket. Another thing that sometimes could be on a tax return, it could be like a one-time loss that showed up for whatever reason. Maybe it was a bad investment, maybe it was a business that went under. That's not going to recur every year, but in that 1 year, maybe you had a $20,000 hit, so that lowered your income. Those are important things to point out to increase your income, because that only happened in that 1 year. And along those lines, you want to look, are there any red flags that you want to explain? Okay, and this is where, again, sort of crafting your financial story really becomes most important, because if your finances look great and perfect, well, that's straightforward and pretty simple, right? But most of us, there are some blemishes on there. Maybe there were some mistakes that we made or lessons that we had to learn the hard way. And you want to understand what those are so you could be upfront about that when you are presenting yourself. And we're going to get into that more in a second. And along those lines, past credit issues, right? Because they're going to pull your credit report that we spoke about in one. So if you have past credit issues, you want to be able to explain that and have a story about that. So very simply, we had a client that we were working with that had about 8 judgments on his credit report, and he had difficulty getting financing because of those judgments. And again, he was just going to the bank asking for financing. They'd pull his credit report and said, hey, I didn't want to touch it, right? So as we worked with him and helped him craft his financial story, the solution that we ended up coming up with, and this is true, even though he had those 8 judgments on his credit report, all the creditors got paid back in full. So he was trying to develop a large piece of real estate right before 2007, 2008. And what happened in 2007, 2008, right? The market took a dive, right? So he actually ended up losing $1 million of his own money, and none of the creditors took a bath, right? So if you just look at the credit report, you see those judgments, it's like, man, I'm not dealing with this guy. He's got 8 judgments. But when you start to craft the story and you say, well, look, here's what happened. The market turned. Everyone knows about that. And this guy spent $1 million of his own money, paid every single one of his creditors back, and made them whole. Is this a guy that you think you'd like to do business with, right? Does that show character, right? So it's like those blemishes, those things that most people are scared about, or maybe they're hoping the bank, doesn't find out about. You want to embrace that and find a way to craft a story that's going to make sense and put you forward in the best light. Does that make sense? Okay. And we already started talking about it, the last step is really creating that new story, right? The future. And that's where you want to make your future so exciting that others want to participate with you in it. And I heard Marcel talking about that earlier today, right? You want to be passionate about it. You want to be excited, because when you're excited and passionate, that's one way that people are going to want to participate with the things that you're doing. As we said, you want to share your vision in alignment with the past as well as the present, and be responsible for your failures in the past and craft stories that make sense along those lines. So the financial story solution is applicable to everyone, whether you're a new investor that's never done a deal before, or whether you're an investor that may have some distressed properties. We got Distressed Dan there, right? This is a guy that has underperforming assets that are distressed. It could be someone that, like Refinance Randy, that just has a mortgage on their properties that is too high, the interest rate, that they need to refinance it lower. It could be someone that actually has success. Their finances look really well, and they have assets that they want to leverage to make more money and create more wealth. What we found is, whether it be people from success or people that are distressed, really their ability to understand how the banks underwrite their deals, oftentimes they're not aware of it. And when you put that in, it expedites and increases the likelihood of them having success and creating wealth. So what I want to do is, I want to take we're going to do one case study to walk you through this and kind of have this come to life with a specific deal, okay? So we're going to do Distressed Dan, and this is actually a real live case study. This is something we did with Dan, although Dan wasn't his real name. But, and we started with step 1, right? Identify the scorecard. And we looked at the income statement and the balance sheet. So who remembers, this is a Q&A time, the income statement and the balance sheet, what single document is that found on? Yes, the personal financial statement, right? Your income statement and your balance sheet, very good, consists of your personal financial statement. So for Dan, Dan had $6,000 coming in a month. He had just retired, he had a pension, so he had $6,000 a month coming in from retirement money. And he also had about $250 a month. He did have one property that actually was producing cash flow for him. But for the most part, he had dilapidated properties which were costing him money every month, which you can look at the expenses there. He had 3 of them that was just bleeding money every month. If you hop over to his balance sheet, you see he had a bunch of assets there with the real estate that he owned, but he also had liabilities. And if you can't see in the back, specifically, he had $77,225 in what we call bad debt, okay? And then he also had another $24,000 liability out there. So as we looked at his personal financial statement, it looked pretty good, except for the bad debt that he had on there. When we looked at his credit score was 600, which was okay. We'd like it to be a little bit higher. There was some work that we had to do there with him. His schedule of real estate owned showed lots of equity, but the problem was it wasn't making any money, right? It wasn't cash flowing. And he had a bunch of unpaid taxes and liens. And that was actually the big problem here, was he was about to lose some properties to sheriff's sale because he hadn't been paying his bills. Because they were negative cash flowing, rather than pay the negative cash flow, he didn't do that. And as a result, he accrued over years tax liens on the property. And then the global pro forma, he had minimal rent coming in, but there was an opportunity to increase the rent on all those assets because none of them were income producing. Step 2, when we looked to understand his past, we looked at his last 2 to 3 years' tax returns. And the taxes, remember I said you want to make sure that the income that you see on the tax return matches the personal financial statement and those other documents, and they did. What happened, though, was his tax returns didn't show a history of the rent roll that he had from the rental property. For whatever reason, he just had a successful track record in construction. And then the 4th thing, the unpaid taxes and multiple dilapidated properties, that ended up being the biggest issue here. When we went to the banks for financing, because he had unpaid taxes on so many properties, they did not want to lend him money until he got that cleaned up. So this was a unique circumstance where one of the properties that had the unpaid taxes actually happened to be in my neck of the woods. It happened to be an area where a lot of students were renting, and I owned property. So we actually ended up partnering with him on the first deal because he couldn't get the financing for it, and turning that first property around, because we knew once we turned around that first property, he then would be able to go out and get the financing on his other properties that he needed to refinance on. Does that make sense? Great. So this is a picture of the first property that we did for him. This was a 4-unit building. As you can see, it needed a full gut renovation there. And when we were done, that was the finished. There we go. Okay. So what the numbers looked like before we renovated the property, again, he was losing $300 a month. Even though he had liabilities on it, the unpaid taxes, he did have a bunch of equity in the property, as you see there with the assets. By the time we were done renovating the property, we also did something else, and we spoke about this yesterday. We spoke about real estate value creation. What were some of the ways that you can create value in real estate? What's that? Yeah, fix it up, yep, through construction, and increase the rents, right? So as you saw, the first thing we did was we fixed it up, and then the second thing was we got it rented and increased the rents so that when we were done, the property actually net cash flowed for him, put $1,500 a month in his pocket every month, and it increased his net worth by $60,000 up to $150,000. So we started with one at a time, and after we did this and resolved the tax situation, he then was able to go to the bank and get a mortgage and actually refinance on this property. And after he refinanced, those were the results. Now that he was able to do that himself, he then went out to his next property and just repeated the same process. Again, beforehand, he was losing $300 a month. He had negative equity on it. When we were done with it, it was making $300 a month. The asset, he had $25,000 of equity, and he was able to put back $65,000 cash in his pocket. Now, Marcel spoke about this yesterday. That $65,000 that he got back, how much did he pay in taxes? None, right? Because it's debt, right? But even after the debt got serviced, he was still making, in all expenses, he was still making $300 a month. So what do you think he did with that 65 grand? No, he went to Jamaica, and I mean, yes, he reinvested it, right? Because he had a couple more properties that he needed to renovate. So this one here was a duplex. Again, it was losing money beforehand. He put money in to renovate it and improve it. And at the end of the day, it was making $750 a month for him. He had $28,000 in equity, and he got another check back for $63,000. And then with that money, remember some of the bad debt that he had at the beginning? He actually was able to pay that off with the money that he got back. And so we started with him in April 2012 at the beginning, when he just had, basically the only income was from the $6,000 in retirement money and the one property where he was making $250 and losing money on the rest. When we were done with him 2 years later, this is a process, right? It doesn't happen overnight. When we were done with him 2 years later, he turned all those expenses into income, and we increased his income by over $44,000. And that's the annual income by the time we were done. So he had literally $250 a month in passive income, and by the end, he had over $44,000 in annual passive income just from the properties he owned, just by improving them. The balance sheet, again, as you saw there, the biggest thing was the $77,000 in negative liabilities there with credit cards and whatnot. By the time we were done, he paid off all of his liabilities, his consumer liabilities, and ended up increasing his net worth by over $230,000 within a 2-year period once all the properties got turned around.